thank you all for coming tonight.
It usually
Thanks to
speaks for like
Boulder
half an hour or
Bookstore
so.
for
It gets
hosting
like
this.
too crazy long.
I
I'm gonna
kinda
read for half an hour.
thought that preparing Julene's intro tonight was going to be a relatively easy task, but after finally being able to read the Ogallala Road over the weekend, I find myself personally involved in her book, and only partly because her family's farm was something like 100 miles from where I grew up in Yuma in northeastern Colorado. So I know that Julene evokes the feeling of the prairie land of my own childhood, and the advent of those giant diesel engines running 24/7 to pump unfathomable amounts of water out of the ground. The same Ogallala aquifer, and I would later learn that that's all essentially fossil water. She reflects my own interest in and sympathy for the Native Americans who met their end as the Great Prairie became the white man's property. And she has surely captured the rural culture and the personality of the Plains settlers in a way that brings me right back to that land. These are things one might expect of a masterful writer. But I was unprepared to find myself and the work that Lynette Marie and I have been doing spoken of in the book, not by name, but by shared values and intention. We actually first met Julene about 3 years ago in San Francisco at a national gathering of slow money. We found ourselves sitting next to her at a big dinner, and we were stunned to learn that she had made the long journey from Longmont to participate in that extraordinary gathering of earthworm investors. And we were even more surprised to learn that she was a writer working on a very challenging book, she said, about her growing up on the plains of Kansas and ultimately choosing to sell the family's farm, which, as she had become painfully aware, was contributing to the plundering of the Ogallala aquifer to the tune of some 200 million gallons a year, which is enough to make even a fracker blush, and contributing to the economic and ecological and moral crisis that was bringing humanity to a frightening crossroads. For me, the Ogallala Road is the story of an American tragedy, of how what was once considered to be a noble way to live and work on the land came to be pernicious, and how the desire to feed the world became a vacuous sham that would undermine the heartland of our nation and help send us downward on a downward spiral as a society. This is a tragedy that we all share. Our nation is built on the almost complete obliteration of a native population whose sacred land we simply appropriated for ourselves. We've stripped our soils and depleted our waters and ripped minerals and fossil fuels out of the earth, leaving great gaping scars in our lands and in our hearts and in our souls that will persist for untold generations. I appreciate that Julene has been able to portray the parade of characters involved in her story as nevertheless very human. She reminds us of our humanity and of the fundamental striving for goodness that lies underneath, and of our vulnerability to going astray. In many ways, we have taken a wrong turn as a society, and Julene was at the crossroads when it happened. And now, like many of us, she's struggling to find the most appropriate ways to respond. Her book is a gift, a treasure, really, a step towards forgiveness and healing and regeneration for us all. Meanwhile, Julene is beginning to take her place as an elder of our tribe. I suspect that the Ogallala Road is just the beginning of her real work in this troubled world, and I greatly look forward to the next phase of her story. For now, please join me in welcoming Julene Bair.
Thank you. Well, I was really pleased to hear that Michael was going to introduce me, but I didn't expect, even though I know Michael and I know how eloquent he can be, that he would use his eloquence on my behalf, and I'm very moved by that. He really captured the spirit of what I'm trying to do in this story. And our shared background, I think, it really strikes a chord in both of us, the Native American populations and the history that we've both witnessed on that land. I want you to know about Michael and Lynette Marie Hanthorne's work. It's Michael Brownlee, Lynette Marie Hanthorne standing in the back of the room. They run so many organizations, I get them mixed up when I try to say them all, but Local Food Shift is big in the mix there. There's Transition Colorado. There's Localization Partners. What have I missed? Are there any others? Yes, there's the Colorado Food Investment Club, which is a local branch of Slow Money. Not a branch, but really Slow Money, the idea that people use their capital to help sane investment in local agriculture and the development of local distribution systems and that sort of thing. Those types of little pods are springing up all over the country, and this is one of them, and I'm a member of that group. So I can't thank you enough, Michael, for that introduction, and both of you for your work. When I look out in the audience, I see so many people I know, so many wonderful friends. I'm so grateful that all of you could make it tonight. Boulder Media Women, yahoo! There's about, 15 or 20 of us here. They're just a wonderful group that's been so supportive throughout my life here in Boulder. I moved here in 2005, and I still think I'm a newcomer, but I don't think I am anymore. And I can tell when I look at this crowd that I really am not. I see Priscilla Stuckey, who managed to make it here all the way from Santa Fe. Not just for this, okay, but it's still just great to see Priscilla back in town. My writing group is here. There's 4 members of my writing group who were totally instrumental in making this book happen. They should have little "and also by." But I don't want to go on too long because then I won't get to read what I want to read, and I want to read, so I'm going to read. I'm going to start at the beginning so you know how the book begins. It's called The Ogallala Road, a memoir of love and reckoning. The first section of the book is called A Rare Find. Falling in love is like reading a novel. It's an act of imagination, a suspension of disbelief. Mary Allen, Rooms of Heaven. These were called the high plains because they were 4,000 feet above sea level. I could feel the altitude and the way the sun sheeted my skin. It was like standing too close to a fire with no means of escaping, unless I dashed back to the car and switched on the air conditioner. Instead, I trudged through wheat stubble that used to be the south end of our pasture, my shoes filling with powdery dirt and my socks with stickers. This western Kansas land had belonged to the Carlsons, my mother's side of the family. When I was 16, my parents traded their share in it for land elsewhere in the county. Like many other successful farmers, they built a new house in town. More than 3 decades had passed since then. Although I knew there wouldn't be water in the creek here, I wanted to walk down its dry bed as I had in childhood, picking up every shiny piece of agate I saw, hoping to discover an arrowhead. In the dry places, men begin to dream, wrote Wright Morris, who grew up north of here in Nebraska. Where rivers run sand, something in man begins to flow. I thought I knew exactly what he meant. The sandy beds of dry creeks unfurl evocatively into the beckoning distance, inscribing their faint script over the land. They entice the exploring spirit. But when I arrived at the Little Beaver, I discovered that the creek was now nothing more than a depression, runoff from the newly farmed pasture land had filled it with silt. Weeds grew where there had once been smooth sand, vacant and pinkish tan. In my childhood, the sand had poured sensuously through my hands, each granule having its own color, shape, size, sheen. Our sense of beauty is a survival instinct, telling us that a place can sustain us for generations to come. I'd always known this in my bones, but it wasn't until many years after I left Kansas and discovered my passion for wilderness that the intuition became conscious. This creek was now ugly. That didn't bode well for the underlying aquifer's ability to support life in the future. Rain and snowmelt couldn't filter into the ground as efficiently through dirt as it could through sand, and sandy creek bottoms were critical to the meager half-inch of recharge that the aquifer received each year. It needed all it could get because irrigation farmers were allowed to pump 40 times that amount. At least the north end of the pasture remained in grass. Standing here as a child, I often pretended that this was the original Kansas, pre-us. The low-growing grass stitched itself over the ground like a woolly tapestry, accented, especially in the spring, by other pastels. Blue grama grass, apricot mallow, the yellow and cream waxen blooms of cactus and yucca. Prairie dogs chirped alarms from mounds of whitish clay, and meadowlarks sang from their perches on yucca spires, their notes climbing and dipping like winding ribbons. Instead of cows, I imagined buffalo grazing the hills. The grass had been named after the buffalo because millions of them once thrived on it. We'd called this our canyon pasture because the creek had carved some cliffs into the otherwise smooth terrain. The canyon was really no more than an interruption in the earth, as my mother called it, but it was the wildest topography in this part of the county. The one-room school that she'd attended, and that my brothers and I also went to before the farm schools were closed and we started riding the bus to town, used to hold field trips here. The boys would try to throw rocks across the canyon, and in its shadowy ruts and ravines, we caught orange-speckled lizards as they dashed beneath the bayonet-shaped leaves of yucca. I remembered my brother Clark's hand on my arm, cautioning me to look closely before grabbing. Once we heard a buzzing sound and jumped back from the bush I'd been about to reach beneath. A tongue-flicking, tail-rattling snake lay coiled at our feet. Its vibrant, diamond-shaped head bobbed in the air, mouth open, fangs bared. "Why is it wiggling its tongue at us?" I asked. "That's how it smells you," said Bruce. Also my elder, but closer to my age than Clark, he loved nothing more than goading me. "It can't strike this far, though," Clark said. "We're safe." The little beaver made a horseshoe turn here. Our old windmills stood on the spit of land formed by the bend. When I paid visits to the canyon as a child, my father's ewes and their lambs would be drinking out of the low troughs. They would scatter as I approached, their hooves sounding like water riffling over rock. But today, only a few cattle grazed the hill above the canyon, moving in and out of the shadows of cumulus clouds. I used to climb the windmill and sit up there for what seemed like hours, transfixed by the shadows. They might have been cast by lily pads or boats on the bottom of a lake. From that height, I could also see our big house's red roof rising above a shelter belt of elms. But if I climbed the windmill's narrow ladder today, I knew too well that I would not see our roof or even the trees. My grandfather Carlson had built the house high on a knoll. With stately trees and a huge red barn beside it, it had been a landmark visible for miles around. Now it was as if all the evidence of our existence had been erased by the wand-like arm of the center pivot irrigation sprinkler I'd parked beside. Like all the sprinklers that circled these plains, this one was made from an 1/8 mile of pipe strung between steel towers. Along the pipe's length, hoses hung down with spigots on the ends, spraying a uniform mist over a 130-acre circle of 6-foot-tall, fully tasseled corn. I could hear the pump engines growl, pulsating on the morning's mounting heat. It hadn't been like this in the mid-60s when we left this place. It had been quiet then. But now, in this second year of the new millennium, you couldn't escape that sound on the high plains. Our current farm, only about 10 miles from here as the crow flew, was no exception. We had 5 irrigation wells, some of which ran all day and all night during the growing season. We drew the water from the most plentiful source of groundwater in the country. The Ogallala Aquifer was the hope and promise at the center of the nation, the source of life that had made habitation possible for millions of years before the words United States, or any words for that matter, had been coined. On geologists' maps, it was roughly the shape of a tornado, wide at the top where it lay under parts of South Dakota, Wyoming, and Nebraska, and narrowing to a funnel in Texas where farmers had been irrigating longest. The maps indicated depletion rates in colors ranging from blue, in much of Nebraska, where water was still plentiful, to brown and almost black in some parts of Kansas and North Texas, meaning gone, pumped dry, or at least to below usable levels. Those dark freckles of high decline were spreading like cancers, gradually enlarging and taking over hundreds of square miles. Okay, now I'm going to skip ahead and I also get a drink of water. What I'm doing out there is I intend to begin at the farm and work my way northeast toward the Republican River, following the dry creek bed of the Little Beaver, because I want to find some of the springs that the Indians used to camp beside and that the pioneers that first came to our county had settled beside. I've read that many of those springs have been dried up, and it means a lot to me to be able to find one because I feel that my family, whatever damage has been done to this land, is going to be read on the surface whether or not there's water there. And my family has been participating in that, so I have a real stake in it. I do find a little spring. It's a small pond. I'm very much excited about that little spring. I feel that it really does warrant school field trips. I mean, here's water coming to the surface of its own accord. How miraculous is that? You know, just think about it. It's like it's gifting itself to the surface. So I crawl, once I see the cows would like to get a drink of water, and I also see a cottonwood tree on the bank, I decide to climb out of the bank and capture some shade. Squatting in the shade, I took such liberal gulps from my father's jug that dribbles ran down my chin. Mom had filled it with iced tea for me that morning, the way she used to do for Dad. It tasted of chlorine, terrible compared with the water I'd drunk a couple of hours ago directly out of the ground in our old canyon pasture. This is who I am, I thought. It had been too long since I'd last done this type of solitary exploring. Motherhood, for one thing, had prevented it. I felt my pocket for my cell phone to call my son, Jake. If he didn't answer, it would mean he'd made it to work that morning. I knew that he'd gotten home before 10 last night, as I'd instructed, because I'd had a friend check on him. "You're treating me like a kindergartner," Jake had complained. No answer. Good. As I was preparing to leave a message, I heard a familiar clanging noise. I looked up to see a white pickup coming down the hill, pulling an empty stock trailer behind it. Great, I thought. Now I've got to deal with some yokel out here in the middle of nowhere. "I tried to warn you," my mother said in my head, where she'd resided for as long as I could remember. "Be careful gallivanting out there all by yourself," she'd cautioned me that morning as I left her house in town. "I've been gallivanting my whole life," I'd told her. "I could change a tire if I had to." I saw from the way her lips pressed together what she was thinking. She could change a tire too. That had not been what she meant. Although I doubted that the man in the pickup would rape me, neither was it likely he would appreciate my being on his property. I wanted to vanish, but it would have been ridiculous to be seen hopping into the ravine. So I stood up. My sudden appearance spooked the blue heeler who rode on the pickup's flat bed. He barked frantically until the truck drew to a stop beside me, and his owner shouted, "Can it, Spider?" "Hello," I said. The dog was keeping me pinned in the gaze of one blue and one brown eye. His lip edged up over canines as he emitted a low growl. "I don't mean to trespass," I said. "I was just looking for Spriggs." The man got out of his pickup, a half-foot taller than I, broad-shouldered and large-boned. He had the dry, dusty look I expected in plainsmen, his skin sun-darkened, his blonde mustache sun-streaked. He pointed toward the creek. "I guess you found this one?" "Yes, it's so hot out, though." The shade looked inviting. He extended a hand. "Ward Albright, Julene Bair. I grew up not far from here." It surprised me that he didn't seem to recognize my surname. There weren't many people in those two counties, Cheyenne and Sherman, who hadn't heard of my father, Harold Bair. He'd been well known for his large herd of sheep. This was mainly cattle country. Ward clasped my hand hard enough to register respect anyway, maybe for my freedom to wander wherever I chose. "Don't worry," he said. "I don't think Convoy would care. I came up to collect these horses I loaned his daughter." He raised his chin toward the hill above us where two bays, a mare and a half-yearling, grazed, for a 4-H project. "This is the first time I ever saw a spring in the Little Beaver. Can you believe that?" He nodded. "There are plenty of them, but when you're a kid, you don't know anything other than what's out your back door." "Used to be plenty of them," I said. "I've read that more than 700 miles of Kansas creeks and rivers no longer flow." "Is that a fact?" "It's a shame what we're doing to the water," I said. He looked perplexed. Oh boy, I thought. Was I about to have a political argument with one of those fanatics who thinks that owning land gives him the right to abuse whatever was on or under it? Then I reminded myself that here in Kansas, it was I who would be considered the fanatic. I probably sounded like one now. Ward said, "Hey, didn't you write that book? I recognize you from the picture on the back of it." This was surprising, to say the least. Besides my mother, the only locals I knew who'd read my essay collection had been one 4th grade and one high school English teacher. "I liked that book so much," Ward said, pausing to reminisce. "It had this melancholy quality about it that reminded me of the Last Picture Show. Larry McMurtry, I'm sure you know his work." "Not as well as I should. In fact, I hadn't gotten around to McMurtry." "I even considered writing to you. I figured your publisher would forward the letter." "You wanted to write to me?" I asked. "Why didn't you?" "Oh, sure now. You would have thought I was some kind of nutcase." "No, I would have been flattered." I looked up into the shadow his hat cast. For the first time, I noticed his eyes, an arresting Caribbean sea green. I lowered my gaze. Dark circles stained the underarms of his t-shirt, a light gray color that a man would grab on a routine morning when he didn't expect anything new to happen. And nothing new was going to happen. After all, this guy wore a silver belt buckle. Burnished by years of wear, it featured your standard calf roper. Jake's dad had cured me of my cowboy fascination. I could imagine how I looked. After dousing my head at the windmill, I'd just jammed my cap back on. It had the word Vita-Vu embroidered on it below a silhouette of that granite mountain range, one of my favorite haunts near Laramie, Wyoming, the town where I lived. Ward's cap also bore a Wyoming emblem, King Ropes, a famous saddler. "Do you read much?" I asked. "Winters get long when you live in the country, and I always liked a good book." Taking a blue kerchief from his hip pocket, he removed his hat, revealing a high forehead. No ring, I couldn't help but notice as he wiped his brow. But ranch and farm types didn't always wear rings. Dad hadn't. "Could use a little of that winter weather now," Ward said. "My favorite author is Cormac McCarthy." Were we really standing in a Kansas pasture? Louis L'Amour I might have expected, or Zane Grey. I like the way he drops into Spanish, I said. Soy yo que traiga las yeguas de las montañas. You memorized that, Ward said. What does it mean? 'Tis I who brings the mares from the mountains, I declaimed. When I taught at the University of Wyoming several years ago, I always assigned all the pretty horses. Even though I think McCarthy was intentionally over-romantic in that book, he was playing with the cowboy myth. I don't know about that, Ward said. His tone made me wonder if he'd ever heard the two words, myth and cowboy, together before. I'll admit McCarthy did get some of the details wrong, he continued. Did you notice that whenever those two boys went into a saloon, they would take their cigarettes out of their shirt pockets and put them on the bar top? Now, a cowboy just wouldn't do that. What would a cowboy do? He'd leave them in his pocket, take them out when he wanted one, then put them back. This had to be the most ridiculous cowboy rule I'd ever heard, and I'd heard a lot of them. I glanced at Ward's rough-out leather boots and his jeans, bunched at the ankle. Jake's dad used to stand before the mirror, making sure his pant legs bunched exactly like that. He'd explained that a cowboy wore his pants long so they wouldn't appear too short when he straddled a horse. He had a whole list. Cowboys didn't wear sunglasses or feathers on their hats. They wouldn't wear a buckle like Ward's unless they'd won it. They wouldn't be caught dead in shorts. They called women ladies, and to him, he said, that's what I would always be. I'd learned the hard way how false such chivalry was. Okay, so I'm gonna go ahead. Can someone tell me what time it is? Because I neglected to.
It's 8 o'clock.
It is? It's 8 o'clock?
Yeah.
We got here at 7:30. So what are we aiming for? Kyle? Where's Kyle? Yeah, I just want time for questions. When should I stop reading if we want questions?
Keep going for now.
Okay, I got an idea of this other thing I want to fit in. Okay? This is about, this kind of gets to the heart of the book. Sort of what the main tension is in the book, this next section. Ward and I, despite what was happening right then, the conversation went on, it got more interesting. I got letters from him, we started seeing each other. We've already been through some hell together. We had to overcome a few things. And now he's come to Thanksgiving dinner at my parents' house. This is actually a very long scene, and I'm going to drop in at the very end of it. It's only my mother who's still living at this point. I said my parents, but it's now just my mother's house. We're down in the basement after dinner watching football. My brother Bruce is there, Ward and I are there, and then my son Jake, and my niece and my nephew, who are adults, young adults. They don't come into play much. They're mentioned. They do come into play in the real scene, but I'm going to have to cut that out. So I'm just going to read a little bit of this. I sat down on the couch nearest Ward. I always thought this had to be the ugliest couch in the world. Dad called it shitmuckle brown. He called every shade of brown shitmuckle, drawled Abby. Jake laughed and examined the matching chair he sat in. Didn't Grandpa and Grandma get these like 40 years ago when you lived on the farm? Those sons of bitches will never wear out, Bruce said. You kids can save some of Harold's money by marking our graves with them instead of headstones. If we don't lose it all before then, I said. We're doing fine, Bruce said. The new ground averaged better than anything. He was referring to the wheat yield on some land for which he'd traded our father's largest pasture. The pasture had been rough prairie, sliced in two by a dry creek like the one in our childhood canyon pasture, while the new ground had been ideal for wheat. Flat as the day is long, Dad used to say about such land. That's a half section of new wheat we've got coming into the coffers, Bruce added, 12,000 bushels in a good year. I was accustomed to bluffing my way through conversations with Bruce, pretending not to need his approval, but now his dark eyes brimmed with pent-up, unsaid things. Was it possible he doubted himself Did he need my approval too? Is that what he was signaling? I said, "It was a good decision, Bruce. I know that." Here was the machine of our family working in its best limping fashion. "What choice did I have?" Bruce said. "We don't run livestock anymore. I could have kept it just so that cowboy bastard we were renting to could play out the romance of the dying breed, or I could have made us some real money." I glanced at my cowboy boyfriend, who smiled lopsidedly at me and shook his head slightly, as if to say, "Don't worry, water off a duck's back." "You sold the pasture that had the cement stock tank in it?" Abby broke in. "Yes," Bruce said. "God, Aunt Julie," Abby said, "remember the time you took us swimming in that stock tank and I couldn't get out? You almost killed me." I'd returned and was living on Dad's farm then. Jake was a baby. "You just thought you couldn't get out," I said. "You were 13 and going through a phase of girlish weakness. I had to get back in and push up on your bottom." My father had inherited that pasture and some of the land around it from his father. When the grass got too short in the canyon pasture on the Carlson farm, he would drive his sheep 10 miles across the county to his own place, where he, Mom, and my brothers had lived before I was born. I would ride on the bench seat of his pickup as we bounced across neighbors' fields, cutting and mending barbed wire fences as we went, honking the horn and thumping the outside of our doors until we finally herded the sheep into the other barnyard, then out into that pasture. Jake's memories of the pasture were probably not as pleasant. When he was 6 and we'd come home for a visit, Dad invited us to ride with him to survey his heifers. Rex, our dog at the time, jumped out of the pickup bed and began chasing them. This was a high-stakes catastrophe. In 10 minutes, he could run a week's worth of weight gain off the heifers. Dad barreled over the hills, threatening to run Rex over. "Don't kill my dog," Jake wailed. "Drive away, fast," I shouted. Rex, fearing abandonment, ran after us. We rode in silence back to the farmstead, my heart rate returning to normal only as Dad's anger subsided. It wouldn't have been the first time he'd killed a family dog. He treated his sheepdogs like kings, but didn't suffer chicken eaters or cow chasers. In this way, and 1,000 others, my brothers and I had learned from him our society's values, rooted in production and finance. Killing the dog to protect our financial interests, it was the same value system that Bruce had exercised selling the pasture. We both had romantic ties to that grass. It was one of the last places in our corner of the county where you could still imagine what the original Kansas had been like. But he was trying to fill the shoes of a father whose only focus had been the bottom line. "Hang on to your land," Dad had always commanded us. If we didn't, he warned that we would die broke, just as he predicted our aunts and uncles who'd sold out would do. He'd been right. Many of them had. But in trading for the wheat ground, Bruce had not only improved our financial security, he'd also demonstrated that we were still in the game. He hadn't let Harold down, as just about everyone had expected him to do. Bruce retrained his gaze on Ward, who hadn't folded the recliner back, but looked comfortable, resting one polished boot on his knee. "You're a grass man, I suppose?" "I have some cattle and I breed horses," Ward said. "Grass doesn't make you money the way farmland does, though." And I'm going to skip ahead a little. "To tell you the truth, I'm not sure what the future holds for the Bair farm," Bruce said. I caught my breath. Our forbidden topic was being broached. Just look at us, I thought. To Ward, we must have seemed less like a farm family than any he'd ever known. With the exception of Mom, asleep upstairs under the quilt she'd made from gaudy polyester squares, not one of us had a Norman Rockwell glow. We didn't speak the vernacular. The older among us voted for liberal presidents. The younger dyed their hair funny colors and cut it into weird shapes and got tattoos. But our patriarch's blood ran thick in our veins. He'd implanted his values in my brothers and me by the time we were 3, the most important one being that first commandment, hang on to your land. Whether we kids would find the wherewithal to obey it had hung in the air our whole lives. Even Harold's grandkids had drunk the commandment with their baby milk. Of the three, only Jake showed overt interest in our conversation. He leaned toward us with his arms planted on his knees, making himself available should there be an opening for him. But I knew that Abby and Josh were listening too. It didn't matter that the Raiders had just scored a touchdown on TV. Every one of Bruce's and my words, when we talked about the farm's future, lofted through the air into the ears of surefire receivers. The tiny bit more here. We'd have to be fools and ingrates to complain, Bruce went on. But I spent too many years being Dad's tractor dog. I told him a long time ago, I really don't want to farm. Neither does Julie. He looked at me. I don't think. I shook my head reluctantly. Hell, Bruce continued, neither of us can farm it. All I can do is watch the grain markets on my computer screen and call our guy on the farm once in a while. He lets me think I'm the boss. I don't have the stamina for farm work. Too old, arthritis. I can put myself out of commission for a week throwing a frisbee for my dog. And Julie doesn't know enough. He looked at me. No offense. His smirk irritated me. I do know a little, I said. During those years I'd spent on the farm when Jake was a baby, then a toddler, Dad had taught me all he could. He'd even entertained the idea of me as his successor. Ron, Bruce said, the guy who lives there and does the real work, isn't getting any younger. What will he do if he gets sick? I added. If he gets sicker, Bruce said, he has emphysema. Farm dust or cigarettes? Ward asked. Both. Julie's right. It would be a catastrophe if he had to go to the hospital in the summer when irrigation's in full swing. I don't know how fast we could find a renter. Even if you did, there'd be no telling how it would work out, Ward said. You don't know the proof of that pudding until it's congealed, and all you've got is lumps. It's an age-old question, Bruce said. What to do with the farm? He allowed a dramatic pause. Do you want to manage a 3,500-acre dryland wheat and irrigated farm? He was being facetious, but also a tad bit serious, honoring Ward and messaging approval to me. Did he think I'd finally made a sane choice in a man? I'm afraid I've never been much of a manager, Bruce, Ward said. As Harold's daughter, it baffled me how a man could say such a thing about himself. Was it just his humility talking? My brother only nodded. Subject closed, for now. So I think Kyle will let us know when we've talked too long, so we've got time for questions. Gail.
I am so impressed with how you brought all of the elements together. The Ogallala Aquifer, the water, the story about Ward, Jake, and Jake's mother, all of your family, the farm, selling the farm, all of that together in perfect proportion so that one element resonates against another. And I'm wondering, how did you work with your editor? Did you get much editorial guidance in pulling that together? Or how did that
Well, there were times when she was really helpful. I mean, in this section, I don't think she. Hello? What? Okay, There were times when my editor, and my editor was fantastic. I loved her. I mean, I want to go live in her house. You know, I would get advice from her all day long. But as far as weaving those different threads, she wasn't particularly, I mean, I had pretty much done that by the time I saw her. The thing she would not allow me to do is reminisce. No reminiscence allowed. We all had childhoods, she would say. You know, you only put it in there if it's pertinent to the story and if it's advancing the story. There were so many things that came up between us. She made me rewrite the whole beginning of part 2, and I thought that was bad. I had to do it 2 times, and then she made me rewrite the ending The entire 1/3 of the book I rewrote in 1 month. At that time, it was 1 month before the deadline. And it was the most productive writing I've probably ever done in my life. You know. Did I say anything about my writing group? This was Gail. Gail, stand up. Would Gail, Lisa, Marilyn, and Elizabeth please stand up and say, yeah. Yeah. They saw me through this. It was wonderful. Other questions?
Have you ever either entertained or actually kept your own version of the book aside from what your editor insists on?
Have I ever entertained what?
Do you have your own version of the book other than what?
Oh, I have so many versions of the book. I mean,
A finished version for you that's different than.
I love this version so much more than that version. I mean, she was right. You know, if I didn't think so, I would fight with her. And there were a few things I would go, no, you know. She just, she's been at it a long time. She nurtures women's voices. That's what she's known for. She's a real champion of literary women's writing. She was just very gifted. I agreed with her. There are times when you don't want to do what they say, but there's times when you should, you know. Yeah. Marion.
Is the Ogallala aquifer are people more aware of it now than when you started this process of trying to bring attention to it?
Oh, much so because of Keystone, the Keystone Pipeline. Now people can say the word and even spell it. A lot of people can even spell it. That's pretty amazing. Because of the Keystone Pipeline, which would, if it went over the Ogallala Aquifer, could leak and cause damage to the aquifer. But my point is, yes, the Keystone Pipeline is horrible, and yes, it would damage the aquifer in that region, but what you're looking at is saturated sands and gravel underground, and the lateral movement of any pollution is slow. What we need to be more worried about is what we call non-point source pollution, which is what industrial agriculture is doing over the entire top of the aquifer, all 174,000 square miles of that surface area practically. I mean, probably not that much, but a large percentage of that is receiving farm chemicals year in, year out, and those chemicals are trickling down into the aquifer. Elizabeth.
I'm fascinated by the process in which you, as a memoirist, find a narrative arc to your whole life.
It's so hard. Yeah, part of that, well, it took me a long time, partly because I was living this story and I didn't even realize it. I sort of jumped off a cliff when I started writing this book. I knew I wanted to write about the aquifer, but I wanted a personal story. I wanted to write about it in a personal way, and I didn't have the story yet. I mean, I had our relationship, our long-lasting relationship to our land. I knew that would play into it, but I didn't realize that that was going to wind up being the focus, the true focus. The true tension in this book is whether or not we can live up to that commandment of my father's, and that our ownership of that land is coming under threat now as this book is opening. It took me a long time to figure out that that's what was really going on, because I had to actually live the story, and then I could look back and go, oh, that's what this is about. There's just so many wrong starts and so much stuff I included that I thought was important that wasn't, and I had to take out. Yeah, finding the arc was really difficult. But I think in the process of writing this, I learned a lot about writing a book-length narrative, which Elizabeth knows a lot about. She has 5 novels, and I learned a lot of this from you. But knowing how to find the central tension, and honing in on that, and then playing it out and staying on, just being like a bird dog, you know, just staying on that scent all the way through. And this, you know, what's interesting is New York editors want you to have a narrative arc. Memoirists, many of the memoirists I know and many essayists that I know resent that. It makes the book more commercial. It makes it more sellable. But, you know, essayists like to wander in their thinking, and they like to digress, and they like to describe and think and do all sorts of things, and they feel like that narrative arc prevents them from doing that. You know, there's all sorts of memoirs. This particular memoir is very novelistic. I set out to write it that way because I knew that's what New York wanted, and because I wanted to gain a popular audience for this topic that matters a lot to me. And now, story is my friend. I like telling stories. I think people deserve stories, you know. But the other kind of writing's wonderful too, you know. It's just that now I'm a little more practiced at this, and I like it a lot.
Have any farmers read it, and what do they think when they read your book?
So far, no farmers have read it. I go on tour to the Midwest next week, and so I'll probably start meeting some farmers. Yeah. Yeah, that'll be interesting. Peter?
What does Ward think of it? And the other question is since the end, towards the end of the book, where you're meeting with those guys at those meetings, and you're trying to introduce the idea of regulation, self-regulation, and all that, I wondered how much of that kind of rationing has happened. So those two questions.
The rationing of the water? Yeah. Okay. Well, I can't answer your question about Ward without giving away something very important about the book, so I'm not going to do that. The question about rationing, there is a little more progress in Kansas. The notorious Republican governor, Sam Brownback, has actually taken some measures which are helping a little bit. He ended the use it or lose it clause in the law, which meant that you had to pump your full water right or lose your water right. He's taking some other measures. I disagree with him on a lot of things that he's doing, but that's probably getting into too many particulars right now. Most of the measures that have been taken to protect the aquifer have been very slight, very minimal. It's not enough. What I think needs to happen to protect the aquifer, the main thing, is the government needs to stop subsidizing very thirsty crops on the high plains, like corn, for instance. And we subsidize it, the taxpayers, subsidize it by with two ways. One with the farm program and also with ethanol policy. With the farm program, we give farmers, up until very recently, we just gave farmers money it was called direct payments. We just gave them money. If they had a history of growing corn, we just gave them money. You know, it was pretty simple. But now it's crop insurance. That's the emphasis now. So now you can grow corn, whether it's irrigated or dry land, whether you're growing it on very marginal soil in a dry place or hills or wherever you're growing it, and you can be insured. You're insured. That you will have a certain yield, and if you don't have that yield, then the government will give you money. It still comes down to the same thing. The government will give you money to grow corn. I don't think we should be given money to grow corn if it needs irrigation, because it's a very thirsty crop.
Julene,
Yeah.
the corn is fed to cattle, isn't that?
Right, that's another argument about corn in general. I mean, if you talk to farmers about changes in policy, they'll say, well, we're feeding the world. You know, how is the world going to eat if you make all these changes and regulate us out of business or regulate us out of the corn business? But in growing corn, especially now, you're not doing much to feed the world. 40% of the corn crop goes to ethanol now because the government requires that a certain amount be mixed into our gasoline. And each year we need more of it. never mind that most people who know anything about ethanol don't really feel like it's a benefit to the environment anymore. Not when you take into account all of the inputs that go into making ethanol. But the other thing that I kind of ran across the other day, and I was writing an editorial about this, another 40% of that crop goes to livestock feed. Of all the livestock, probably the majority goes to cattle. Cattle process the protein in that corn at a ratio of 20-1. So every measure of for every 1 calorie, I looked this up the other day and now I'm not so sure, I bet you Kay knows, for every 1 something of corn protein that goes into the cow.
But I do have another point.
I bet you do. For every 20 that goes into the cow, 1 comes out in protein. So, we're losing a lot of the benefit of that protein by feeding it to livestock. What's your point, Kay?
Well, just that the return on energy invested to produce a gallon of ethanol is already so paltry that it's not worth producing, right? But when you expend the energy that it takes to irrigate corn,
Right.
then that return goes down to 1-to-1 or less.
Right, and are they thinking also about the nitrogen fertilizer and the energy that goes into making that?
So it absolutely should be against the law to produce corn for ethanol through irrigation.
Right.
Yeah.
So we're just paying farmers to drain the aquifer, and that's the government. It's a national resource, and we're spending our money to drain our own national resource. So, yeah.
Have there been any surprising peacemaking relationships that have come from the observers or participants or stakeholders as the awareness of the situation grows in that area?
It's starting to happen a little bit. Yeah, I think so. I mean, the thing that's getting all this news attention lately is in Kansas, one of those little, I don't know how many farmers are in this particular area, 2 or 3 dozen, a small county, a small corner of a county in western Kansas, have agreed voluntarily, and this is like a big deal that they've done this, to cut back their water use by 20% because they want to try to conserve it. They want to make it last longer. That's headway. That is headway. It's getting a lot of attention. Yeah.
What are your thoughts on the challenges of doing what's right and doing what's most economic, where those two things clash? Because I see those, the economic model and, the need to make money clashing quite regularly with what's the most, sound thing to do.
Yeah, that's one of the things this book is about, and it's not about it in someone else's heart and soul. It's about it in my own. When we were looking at the possibility of selling our farm, I thought a lot about how much we could make from selling it. And I thought a lot about how the land would be hurt. And, you have to read the book to figure out the decision I made and how I dealt with that. But I have to say that it was really a breakthrough for me when I realized that I am equally and diametrically, contradictorily motivated by greed and altruism for the environment. Equally, I have to say it. I mean, it's just, they almost cancel. It's at war in me. And if we had a guiding spiritual ethic in our culture, a land ethic that was also spiritual, and I make a comparison in the book to the way the Hopi farmed, because I had the opportunity to visit with the Hopi tribe at one point when I was a young woman, and that always stuck with me, because at that time they were fighting this water tower in the village of Hautevilla, which is the most traditional village in the Hopi reservation, the Bureau of Indian Affairs wanted to put in a water tower, and they were doing everything they could to stop it because they knew that if they had water that readily available, that they would waste it, and eventually their spring would dry out. It wouldn't take that long. Their spring would dry out. So they were adamantly opposed to it. And then you have our culture. I mean, we knew that aquifer was limited, you know. I mean, every time you read a news story about it, it says, farmers didn't know, they thought it was limitless, but oh my God, it's limited. Well, I read in The Great Plains by Prescott, what's his name? I can't say his name right now because I've got him mixed up with another Prescott I know. But in the Great Plains, he's a wonderful historian. He tells the story of Willard D. Johnson, this geologist who came to the plains for the U.S. It wasn't the U.S. Department of Agriculture yet. It was like around 1900. And he did a survey, and he said that, yeah, there's water under the land, but if you pump it, you will run out. You know, you'll drain the storage. It won't take long, and it'll be gone. I mean, not long in terms of geologic time. So, I mean, we've always known that. But we chose instead, and then we want and accept the government's money to drain our water supply, whereas the Hopi were fighting the government for the same reason. In the book, I call that horizontal versus vertical thinking. The Hopi are okay with life being horizontal. Nothing's changed in 600 years. I mean, some things have changed, and I don't know how they feel about those changes. They have vehicles and so on, but they're still living in the same kinds of buildings they lived in 600 years ago. They're still farming the same way they farmed 600 years ago. They still have the same diversity as a consequence, the same ecological diversity. So it's sustainable, you know. Whereas we always want more of everything. We want more money, mostly, you know, want more production, better houses. We want everything to improve all the time. But as everything is improving, the quality is going down on the other side. You know, we're losing the wildlife, we're losing the grass, the carbon sink, you know, the atmosphere, you name it. That might be a good time. Well, one more question. Yeah.
I just have to say I love the title you chose, and I love the word Ogallala.
Yeah, I do too. Yeah. Yeah, you know, it was really interesting. At first, you see how this went. There was a lot of back and forth with the publisher about the title. At first, I suggested having Ogallala in the title, and it's not quite as simple as I paint it, because there was a lot of back and forth and debate, but they said, well, nobody knows what the Ogallala is, nobody can pronounce it, nobody can spell it, you probably don't want to put it in the title. And I said, oh yeah, you're right. So then we thought, titles, we tried so many titles. And finally, at the end, it was they. I had said something, maybe in the text, I can't even remember how this happened, but maybe I suggested the Ogallala Road. I said, well, I don't really think it's going to work because nobody can spell it or blah, blah. And they said, we love it, Ogallala Road. I think it was because by then they knew what the Ogallala was, you know. So I just figure the people will have to catch up, you know, and that's what the book's purpose is, really, is to spread word about the Ogallala.
What does Ogallala mean?
It means, in the original Sioux, which it comes from Oglala, for the Oglala Sioux, and that meant scattered throughout, or poured out her own, was one definition I read. The Sioux which they thought of themselves, or do think of themselves as the Lakota, and they were spread throughout such a large area. So it was inadvertent, but it seems so suitable for the aquifer. I think that's it. I think that was our last question. Okay.